Доброго дня. Доброго дня всім, шановні колеги. Є можливість, то включіть, будь ласка, камери для того, щоб можна було вас зараз всіх побачити. Неймовірно раді. І сьогодні ми вас вітаємо із Днем Європи. Колеги, сьогодні другий день нашого європейського тижня, так би мовити, ми його так назвали. Разом з тим, сьогодні, відповідно до указу президента, якраз ми відзначаємо День Європи в Україні. Наш сьогоднішній захід якраз і присвячений правам людини, недискримінації та гендерної рівності, і фактично є таким логічним продовженням Тижня Європи. Колеги, розбудова України як європейської держави передбачає формування нового світогляду і демократичних цінностей, які базуються на верховенстві права, на правах людини, на забезпеченні рівних можливостей для самореалізації, ну і незалежно від їхньої статі, від віку, від національності. І саме ці цінності і покладені в основу системи державного управління і державної служби. І фактично це один із ключів, яким Україна відкриватиме браму Європейського Союзу. Для Національного агентства забезпечення прав людини, безбар'єрності, інклюзивності суспільства, недискримінації, гендерної рівності, як ви змогли за всі ці роки пересвідчитися, є пріоритетом. В умовах війни, а ми сьогодні теж проснулися від вибухів, і з цього, напевно, і варто починати. Разом з тим ми з вами живемо і навчилися жити, адаптувалися до таких надзвичайно незвичних умов і фактично навчилися жити в умовах кризи, в умовах війни. Ми зберігли саме головне – це професійне ядро управлінського потенціалу державної служби. І зараз фактично нам доводиться працювати в таких мінливих і нестабільних умовах. Але попри це, публічна служба є фундаментом держави. І я б хотіла відзначити таке активне зростання лідерства жінок на національному рівні і у місцевому самоврядуванні. Особливо це відчувається на територіях, де ведуться активні бойові дії або у наближених до них районах. Питання лише в тому, чому зараз жіноче лідерство настільки актуальним? Тим, що наша сильна стать зараз боронить нашу країну. І по факту те, що роблять вони, це під силу лише чоловікам, знаходитися в тих умовах, напевно, ми навіть собі не можемо уявити, наскільки жахливою є та ситуація. Тому сьогодні жінки беруть всю відповідальність і демонструють активність в таких незвичних, так, дійсно, явищах, як брати відповідальність за управлінські рішення. Якщо раніше більш злаженою була робота в такої синергії із чоловічою статтю. Тому я б хотіла відзначити сьогодні, що вагомі досягнення, зокрема і в сфері забезпечення рівного представництва жінок і чоловіків на вищих рівнях прийняття рішень. Тобто ми демонструємо і сьогодні, як і вчора, нашу незламність і вміння приймати відповідальні рішення, незалежно, чоловіки чи жінки. Тобто демонструємо рівність і недискримінацію прав чоловіків і жінок. Тобто до того я б хотіла підкреслити, що ми посилюємо інтеграцію гендерної рівності в усіх напрямах державної служби. І один із найвагоміших аспектів діяльності Національного агентства – це дійсно забезпечення і навчання публічних службовців з питань прав людини і гендерної рівності. Фактично, ця робота для нас є постійною, вона є систематичною і, що дуже приємно відзначити, вона є доволі успішною. І щороку у нас збільшується кількість тем і програм саме з цих питань. І хочу також відзначити, що коли ми проводимо аналіз і моніторинг професійних потреб в навчанні, то у нас дійсно зростає кількість бажаючих підвищити кваліфікацію якраз із питань гендерної рівності з недискримінації. Безумовно, досягнення таких вагомих результатів, звісно, сприяє якраз наша потужна співпраця із міжнародними партнерами, серед яких якраз є ООН «Жінки в Україні». Ми давно співпрацюємо із програмою ООН «Жінки в Україні», і у 2021 році ми підписали меморандум про взаєморозуміння і подальшу співпрацю, власне, результатом якого і стала розробка і виконання багатьох проєктів і ініціатив. І я з великою приємністю зараз хочу запросити до слова керівницю офісу, представницю ООН «Жінки в Україні» Сабін Фрейзер-Гюнеш. Пані Сабін, я прошу зараз вас до слова. Слово вам.
Thank you very much, Natalia, for this very warm introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me today on Europe Day to present a little bit about the importance of gender equality and why this is particularly important for EU accession. It is a great honor to be here, of course, specifically today when Ukraine officially celebrates for the first time Europe Day. So like the countries within the European Union, Ukraine stands strong next to the flag with the yellow stars in celebration of today. We also know that van der Leyen is in Kiev today to celebrate. So I think that this is very much a day full of expectations and a day to really to look forward to the future and a more positive future than the way that we started the day with, of course, the attacks by the Russian Federation, which affected, I believe, all of us in Kiev this morning and other parts of the country. So rather than looking at the negatives, we have the occasion to look at the positives and to very much see the EU integration process as a way to not only resist the Russian aggression, but also to fast track gender equality in the country. So I believe I have approximately half an hour to present some slides on the importance of gender equality in Ukraine and for the EU integration process. I hope that the translation is working well. I hope that you can follow, and I hope that I'm not speaking too quickly. The slides that I have are in English, but I hope that we will translate them and then we will be able to share them with the participants so that you will also have them in Ukrainian for later. So I will try to start sharing my screen. But first, while I try to do that, what I want to say, just as in the start, is that, of course, the conflict and the renewed large-scale aggression by Russia has really disproportionately affected women and girls. So I just want to start with a little bit of a reminder of how terrible this renewed aggression has been on women and girls of Ukraine. Just to remind you that, of course, the number of people who have lost their lives is not yet sure. We don't have precise numbers, but we do know the UN has verified that at least 2,296 women and girls have lost their lives since February 2022. So, of course, the war has had this direct, tragic effect on all families and communities of this country. In addition to that, of course, we know that a very large number of women and girls and men and boys have been forced to be displaced. So we estimate that approximately 90% of all the refugees from Ukraine are either women or children. So of course, in terms of the refugees, this has created a tremendous amount of challenges for women who have found themselves without their husbands, without their partners, taking care of children outside of Ukraine, particularly in the European Union. We also know that inside Ukraine, we still have a very large number of displaced persons. And here we estimate that 68% of those who are displaced are women. Also, the war has had a terrible toll, of course, on the service provision for women who have had, particularly in frontline areas, tremendous difficulties in accessing health services, education services, and other support that they need to be able to support themselves and their families. We also know that the economic situation has been particularly detrimental to women. So one statistic that we have is that when we look at IDPs, internally displaced persons, we see that men say that now that 38% of the men rely on salary to be able to survive, and only 25% of women can rely on salary. So what that means is that women have less access to economic life, to salaries, to economic income, so they're increasingly dependent on either humanitarian assistance or government assistance. So what the UN estimates as of February this year is that 7.8 million women and girls in the country need humanitarian assistance. So of course, this is a huge number, and we see that the situation remains very difficult for women and girls. And then I just want to add that, of course, women, but also men and boys, girls, have also been suffering the terrible crimes of conflict-related sexual violence, particularly since February last year. And this is a crime that deserves accountability, where we're going to need to find a way to ensure justice for the survivors of this crime. So conflict-related sexual violence, unfortunately, is another terrible consequence of the war. Now, having said how difficult the situation is, I want to look a little bit towards the positive and just emphasize how gender-responsive governance and reform is so important for Ukraine, and how Ukraine has already made such significant progress. So what is Ukraine's position on the advancements of gender-responsive governance? What we see is that despite the very difficult year last year, there were some key advances in the normative framework. So it is really remarkable that amidst a full-scale war, Ukraine was able to ratify the Istanbul Convention. So the Council of Europe's Istanbul Convention was finally ratified by Ukraine, and this is a tremendous progress. In addition to that, the government passed the state strategy on equal rights and opportunities for men and women, a very key strategy to ensure equality. There was also the national strategy on gender equality in education. There was a revised national action plan on UN Security Council Resolution 1325, focused on women, peace, and security. There was also a cooperation agreement between the government of Ukraine and the UN on the prevention and response to conflict-related sexual violence. And we've also seen progress on some very specific legislation. For example, on the national strategy on decreasing the gender pay gap. That was not yet passed yet, but there was a drafting of a first draft. And also drafting of a roadmap for amendments to legislation on parental leave. We've also seen progress at the local level with a new law on regional policy and recovery policy in regions and communities, which is gender sensitive. So really what I think we see that in Ukraine, there is a very strong legal basis for gender equality. Now, I also just want to bring up a few statistics on gender responsive governance. It is very important that women lead, participate in, and benefit equally from government systems. And what we have in Ukraine is a situation where 84 women are members of parliament out of the 416 members of parliament. Of course, the deputy head of parliament is a woman. And we see a situation where women represent approximately 20% of the parliamentarians. Honestly, this figure is lower than in the majority of European member states. The average of women in parliaments in the EU is 33%. So here there is still some work to be done to ensure that we have a stronger representation of women in parliament, even though, of course, there are some very strong women parliamentarians, and there is a women's caucus or a caucus on gender equality, which has an important voice. In terms of the cabinet, 5 out of the 22 members of the cabinet are women. And we have some very important women as deputy prime ministers and women playing a very important role in the cabinet. Here too, this is less than what we see in EU member states. Of course, there are a few countries in the EU who have gender equality in cabinets. So the country that I come from, Belgium, has a gender balanced cabinet, which means that we have 50-50 men and women in the cabinet. So some countries in the EU have made a specific political commitment to ensure equality in cabinets. We also have equality in the cabinet of France, Spain, and several other EU countries. But of course, this is still not, there are certain EU countries where this is not yet the case, but this is something also potentially to aspire to. Of course, we have a very positive number in Ukraine, which is that 75.9% of civil servants are women. But here, the number of senior civil officials is not yet equal. So approximately 33% of senior officials, which are women. Now, one thing, of course, that we as UN Women have found to be very important is the use of quotas. So to use preferential measures so that more women are elected. And actually at the Commission on the Status of Women, which is one of our key yearly meetings on gender equality, there was an agreed conclusion a couple of years to call for gender quotas as a way to get 50-50 of elected women in parliaments and in other elected positions. So we're looking forward to really the application of effective quotas in Ukraine. Also to say at the local level, the number that we have is that approximately 30% of local members of local councils in Ukraine are women. So approximately 3,800 women have been elected in local councils. This number, you may have a more updated number than this, but this is the number that we have from approximately a year ago. What we also see is that there is some important legislation, such as the law that I mentioned before on regional policy and recovery policy in regions and communities, which really allow for a more gender responsive approach. So for example, we see that there are mandatory gender impact assessments of development planning. So it is extremely important that women are able to fully participate in planning and budgeting at the local level. And so we see that the legislation in Ukraine really allows for that. What we're seeing is that in certain specific parts of the country, for example, women with disabilities have gained better access to healthcare because of the role that women have been able to play in the planning and budgeting, and the real focus now on women who are in the biggest need, such as women with disabilities. In Ukraine, there is a strong public administration, which is gender responsive. So what we see is that there is the use of strong tools to ensure that public administration and governance is gender responsive. So for example, what we know is that various government bodies have conducted gender audits within their bodies. So that means that, for example, in ministries, several ministries have conducted gender audits to understand how positions are distributed within their ministries, what policies and programs exist within their ministries to ensure gender equality. For example, the State Statistics Service of Ukraine approved a plan for gender responsive changes in policies and procedures after their gender audit to really ensure that women are able to fully work in the State Statistics Service, and that the statistics that the service is gathering are gender responsive and disaggregated. Of course, as Natalia pointed out, we work very closely together, and really the National Agency for Civil Service is a champion in gender equality. The NACS has institutionalized gender audits as an integral to government processes, and there is a specific training curriculum on gender audits which NACS offers. So this training on conducting gender audits in executive bodies and local self-government institutions is a very important training, and one that I hope that those of you who are online today have benefited from, because this will really allow you to conduct those audits within your own institutions and to ensure that your own institutions are gender responsive. The NACS is a very important institution on promoting gender equality through various trainings. So, for example, last year, NACS also developed and institutionalized a curriculum for civil servants on preventing and responding to conflict-related sexual violence. So this is another very important tool to ensure that we're all fully aware on how we best prevent and respond to conflict-related sexual violence. So this is so important to see this institutionalization of gender equality through training, and then through laws, policies, but then also, of course, it's so important to implement the laws and policies. And so we see this training as a key way to do that. Now, I just wanted to mention maybe a couple of gaps that have been identified in Ukraine today. One is the issue of sexual harassment. So now that Ukraine has signed on to the Istanbul Convention, there are potentially some gaps. For example, on the Article 1 of the Law of Ukraine on ensuring equal rights and opportunities for men and women. This could be strengthened to ensure that that all forms of harassment are seen as a criminal offense, and that victims are provided with compensation. Another area that perhaps could use some strengthening is gender responsive budgeting at the state and local levels. So even though there is an experience of using gender responsive budgeting in Ukraine, this is not mandatory, and both at the state and local levels, we don't always see that gender responsive budgeting is applied. It'll be really interesting to see how a gender perspective is integrated in the recovery plan for Ukraine, and then the future planning for recovery of the country. I just want to say that if you are looking for more specific recommendations on what Ukraine can do to fast track gender equality and women's empowerment, I strongly recommend that you look at the concluding observations of the 9th periodic review of the CEDAW, so the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination of Women, where Ukraine presented its periodic review last year. And there were some very specific recommendations from the CEDAW committee, which I think can be very useful to show the way forward. The government of Ukraine, and particularly the Commissioner on Gender Equality, Ms. Levchenko, and her office and her partners are working together now on a roadmap on how to implement the recommendations of the CEDAW committee. Now I'd like to just move on to another issue, which is the direct link with the European Union. And what is the situation with the European Union on gender responsive governance and reforms? So gender equality in the European Union is a fundamental value. So equality between men and women is one of the EU's fundamental values, and promoting it is an obligation which is enshrined in the treaty. Von der Leyen's Commission has really emphasized gender equality as a key issue and something that she has put at the forefront of her political actions. The Commission, the EU Commission, is gender balanced. So for the first time ever, we have an equal number of men and women amongst commissioners of the EU. The goal in the union is to really have a union of equality where women and men, girls and boys, in all their diversity are free to pursue their chosen paths in life, have equal opportunities to thrive in, participate in, and lead European society. So this is, I think today on the 9th of May, it's important to really underline how gender equality is a key issue for the success of the European Union project. Now, the EU has its own gender equality strategy. So this is an internal strategy for EU member states to really try to ensure that there is more gender equality within the EU member states themselves. So some of the objectives of this strategy include trying to put an end to gender-based violence, trying to also end gender stereotypes and discrimination, which continues to exist in EU member states, to close gaps in the labor market, such as the gender pay gap and the pension gaps. So what that means is that still in European member states is that men and women do not receive the same salary for the same work. They also do not receive the same pensions because what we see is that generally men are contributing longer to pensions, so they are able to work more years. So they tend to receive more pensions than women within the European Union countries as well. So these are things that are also of key concern in member states. It's also really important to achieve equal participation of men and women in different sectors of the economy. So not to ensure that women are somehow kept in more social spheres of the economy, and that they do not get access to, for example, STEM. So for high level science, research, here are areas where women are still lagging behind in the EU. And finally, it is still important to secure gender equality and really 50-50 in decision-making in politics in the EU. So one of the things that this EU gender equality strategy does is to try to ensure gender mainstreaming in policies and programs throughout EU member states. Now, I just wanted to mention a few areas of progress in 2022 in the European Union. So there is a new directive on combating violence against women and domestic violence. And what this is trying to ensure that there's a minimum standard for all member states so that certain forms of violence are criminalized and that victims are supported and protected, and that they're given access to justice, and that there are more measures in place for preventing violence. So I think that this directive potentially could be very useful for Ukraine, as Ukraine now perhaps strengthens its legislation, as I mentioned earlier, in response to the signing of the Istanbul Convention. This directive hopefully can provide some guidance. Another new directive in the EU is on gender balance on company boards. So that's one key area where we see inequality. So if you look at the big companies in the EU, you generally find on those boards, 2/3 of the board members are men. So now this new directive is trying to ensure that the biggest companies in the European Union, but also small and medium-sized companies, have gender balance so that men and women are present on those boards in equal numbers. The issue of equal pay, so there's adoption of a new directive to help ensure equal pay for equal work or work of equal value between men and women, because as I said, that is still a problem in the EU. And then there have been also recommendations on the care economy. So to ensure that there is long-term care and early childhood care in the EU, so that way it is not only women that are burdened with taking care of children and taking care of elderly, but really that care is equally distributed between men and women, and that there is financing to ensure that there's enough care measures to support both young people and more elderly. So now what I'd like to get to is, what is the link with UN Women? Why am I here today to speak to you? What are we doing here, and how can we help accompany you on the EU integration path? Just very briefly, and sorry, here the slide is written in very small language, but I just wanted to say that UN Women is in Ukraine since 2015. And we are particularly eager to work with government partners on providing technical inputs and advice and expertise on gender equality. So we are here very much to support you in the development of laws and policies on gender equality, but also to ensure that gender is mainstreamed through other laws and policies, which at first glance may not seem focused on women and girls, but even, for example, laws on transport, on urban development, on recovery, really could benefit from gender mainstreaming, and so we're here to help you on that. We're also here to facilitate public consultations between government and other duty bearers, such as women-led organizations. Of course, women-led organizations are one of our key partners, and that what we find is that women-led organizations, particularly now, are taking the lead in responding to the humanitarian needs in the country. So we are very eager to continue to support women-led organizations, particularly those working with the most vulnerable women, displaced women, disabled women, Roma women. Those are all groups that we try to support, and to try to support also their inclusion in decision-making, particularly at the local level. As we said before, we also work very closely with government counterparts on training. So that is why NACS is such a strong partner for us. That's why we have a memorandum of understanding, because we work together on ensuring curriculum which can really institutionalize gender equality. We also try to support women-led organizations with financing. So we have actually a fund called the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund, which has distributed already in 2022 and 2023, $10 million US, particularly to women-led organizations. So this is monies to support women-led organizations to respond to the humanitarian crisis. And finally, working very closely with the government of Ukraine, we work on knowledge products. And one thing that I think is extremely important, and I believe that you all agree on this, is the collection of gender disaggregated data. So to really ensure that we have the evidence and data to speak confidently about the needs of women and girls in this country. So this, of course, is now particularly difficult within the context of full-fledged war to collect gender disaggregated data, but this is something that we look forward to working on together throughout this year and beyond. Now, I just wanted to say a few words on the EU accession process. This is something which is very dear to us at UN Women, because we really see EU accession as a way to fast-track gender equality. A huge congratulations to Ukraine for having obtained candidacy status last June. This is amazing that within full-fledged war, Ukraine was able to respond to the questionnaire so quickly and was able to secure candidacy status. As you know, the Commission came out with an opinion, so the European Commission came out with an opinion requesting progress in 7 areas. Now, the government of Ukraine is starting to develop a national plan of adaptation of Ukraine to the EU acquis and has started a process of self-screening. So this is one thing that we are happy to support, the process of self-screening. So to support the government in Ukraine as it looks at its own legislation and tries to see how it is compliant with current EU law. So for us at UN Women, what's very important is to ensure that also legislation related to gender equality is also taken into consideration. Because what we believe is that the European Union has something that we call the gender acquis. So what we believe is that within the EU, there is already legislation on gender equality. And it's important now to see exactly where Ukraine's legislation fits compared to the existing EU gender acquis and what gaps may exist. We hope to support the government of Ukraine in mainstreaming the gender equality acquis into all planning and programming related to the national program. We really hope to also work with the European Union itself to ensure that gender equality is prioritized in EU programming and financing as part of the accession process. We know that, of course, the EU accession process is going to be a long-term process. It is not a sprint, it is very much a marathon. So we hope to be together with you supporting the EU accession process to really make it a way to fast track gender equality. I just wanted to tell you that we have something that we call the Gender Equality Facility. So this is a program designed to support the government to ensure that gender equality is prioritized. It is something that we have used in other countries. And one of the main tools that we use is gender mainstreaming. So it's really to ensure that the EU gender equality acquis is mainstream in planning, programming, budgeting, in all of your efforts to move ahead in the accession process. So this is something that we're really hoping to roll out in the coming months and to work together on implementing this equality facility in Ukraine over the coming years. So this is something that we have done in other candidate countries. It is something that we are currently doing in Albania, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and North Macedonia. So it is to look at EU laws, rules, resolutions, regulations, directives, and others, and to make sure that where gender equality already exists in this acquis, that is also transposed in the national legislation and laws and policies. So the importance is to ensure that this gender equality acquis is transposed into national local laws and policies, but it's also to help ensure that institutions, procedures, budgets are also able to really implement the legislation on gender equality in Ukraine. So that's what we look forward to working closely with you together. I'm almost finished. I think I have one more slide. which is a bit of a schematic, but really what we believe is that to really ensure that gender equality is integrated in the EU process will require deep partnerships. So with a range of different partners in Ukraine. So obviously the Prime Minister's office, which has a lead on European integration and gender equality, but also the National Gender Machinery, which is already working on EU issues. So this means, of course, the Commissioner for Gender Equality, but also the Ministry for Social Policy. Working with ministries across the board is very important. And of course, what is very nice in Ukraine is that very often you have deputy ministers who are both ministers on EU integration and on gender equality. So this is a key entry point. But what we expect, of course, with the EU integration process is that there will be EU units in different ministries, and we look forward to working closely with them on gender equality and ensuring that gender is integrated in the different sectoral plans and policies. And finally, it's very important that this be not only a national process, but that regions and municipalities also be deeply included, together with civil society, academia, media, and all really the stakeholders in Ukraine. So I think that this is really an exciting moment, and it's such an honor to be able to talk about this today on the 9th of May, when Ukraine celebrates for the first time officially Europe Day. I hope that what I was able to show you today is that this is really a wonderful opportunity now to move ahead on gender equality. Ukraine is already very far advanced. In some areas, you may even be more advanced than certain EU member states. But this is a great opportunity on one hand for Ukraine to show EU member states what progress you already have made, and to fill whatever gaps currently still exist. So I will leave it at that and say a big thank you for this opportunity. And I'm very much looking forward to continuing our cooperation between UN Women and the NACS and the rest of the government of Ukraine. And as I said, of course, the women-led organizations, the women's movement is, of course, a very strong partner and ally with us on this too. So thank you very much.
Пані Сабіна, я також щиро дякую вам за вашу презентацію, за ваш виступ. Ми з великою зацікавленістю слухали. От разом з тим я хочу відмітити наше партнерство. І щиро дякую вашому проєкту і вашим зусиллям, які ви докладаєте для того, щоб ми розвивали напрям недискримінації, гендерної рівності. І зараз ширимо ці загальні знання для усіх публічних службовців. Тому на сьогодні, колеги, ми завершуємо наш другий день, і сьогодні ми відзначаємо День Європи в Україні. У нас є і поважні гості. Однак ми щиро дякуємо нашим партнерам з ООН «Жінки». От, і сьогоднішня доповідь, вона вражаюча. Ми чітко знаємо тепер наші орієнтири, як ми рухаємося далі і над чим ми працюємо. Тому я бажаю всім сьогодні вдалого дня, без тривог, бажаю спокою і натхненного, результативного сьогоднішнього робочого дня. Всім дякую і до зустрічі завтра. На все добре, до побачення.
До побачення.
Дякую.
До побачення.
До побачення.
Побачення. До побачення.